Ma'am, with all due respect, this is the National Defense Symposium at Fort Leavenworth, the intellectual heart of the United States Army. It's not a local library's book club meeting. Your name is not on the access roster. The words, spoken by a young, ramrod-straight sergeant with a chest full of self-importance and a name tape that read Miller, were designed to cut, to dismiss, to put the unassuming woman in her place. The small crowd of colonels and majors waiting behind her shifted, a few of them offering thin, complicit smiles. They saw what Sergeant Miller saw, a woman in her late 50s, perhaps dressed in a plain, almost shapeless gray pantsuit that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, with strands of silver catching the harsh fluorescent light of the atrium. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, save for a simple, practical watch. In her hands, she clutched the strap of a worn leather satchel, its surface cracked and faded like an old map. She looked like a mid-level university administrator who had taken a wrong turn, a harmless academic utterly out of place amongst the crisp, decorated uniforms and the palpable tension of a high-stakes military gathering. She offered no reaction to the sergeant's barb. Her face remained a placid mask of neutrality. Her eyes, a startlingly clear and intelligent gray, simply held his, patient and unwavering. She had presented her identification, a simple Department of Defense civilian credential, and stood in silence as he had theatrically tapped at his terminal, his theatricality growing with each passing second of his feigned search. He was performing for the officers behind him, establishing his small kingdom of the doorway, proving that he, Sergeant Miller, was the unbreachable wall protecting this sanctum of strategic thought. Dr. Thorne, he said, reading the name off the card with exaggerated slowness, as if the title doctor was a particularly amusing joke. Doctor of what exactly? Ancient history? Because you're about to become ancient history if you don't step out of this line and clear the way for authorized personnel. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the climate control system and the distant, muffled sound of a helicopter. Dr. Thorne did not move. She did not argue. She did not even blink. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the sergeant's fidgeting energy. He puffed out his chest, a gesture of dominance learned on 1,000 parade grounds, and leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl. Look, lady, I don't know who you are, and frankly, I don't care. What I do know is that 300 of the Army's most senior leaders, including General Madsen himself, are in that auditorium. My job is to ensure that only the right people get through this door. And you, he said, tapping her ID card with a dismissive flick of his finger, are not the right people. But then, from the back of the line, a voice, a full-bird colonel with an impatient frown, called out, "Sergeant, what's the hold-up?" Miller straightened instantly, his demeanor shifting to one of crisp efficiency. "Just handling a minor security discrepancy, sir. This individual's credentials are not registering in the system. I'm sure it's just a clerical error," he added, the last part a lie meant to placate the senior officer, a lie that dripped with condescension toward the woman he was blocking. But as Miller turned back, he saw something that gave him a moment's pause. The woman, Dr. Thorne, had shifted her stance ever so slightly. It was a minute adjustment, almost imperceptible, but her weight was now perfectly balanced, her posture aligned with a kind of geometric precision that was utterly at odds with her soft, civilian appearance. It was a stance of profound readiness, of absolute calm before a storm. It was the stance of a professional. If you believe that true strength requires no announcement, type competence below. The scene at the entrance to the Sherman Theater had become an uncomfortable spectacle, a microcosm of bureaucratic friction grinding against an immovable object of silent patience. Sergeant Miller, emboldened by the attention of the senior officers, continued his public shaming, his voice a tool of petty tyranny. "Ma'am, I have now asked you 3 times to step aside. Your persistence is bordering on disruptive. The system, which is a state-of-the-art, billion-dollar identity management network, says you do not exist in the context of this symposium. Therefore, you do not exist. It's that simple." He gestured expansively at the gleaming, high-tech security gate, a marvel of biometric scanners and encrypted checkpoints. This isn't a suggestion box. It's a statement of fact. You are not on the list behind Dr. Thorne. The line of officers grew longer, their impatience curdling into a mixture of annoyance and mild amusement. They were men accustomed to schedules, to precision, to a world where obstacles were either overcome or removed. This strange, quiet woman was an anomaly, a glitch in the day's meticulously planned operations. Dr. Thorne, for her part, simply shifted her worn leather satchel from one hand to the other. The movement was slow, deliberate, and economical. Her gaze drifted past the sergeant, scanning the architecture of the atrium, the placement of the security cameras, the flow of personnel. She was not seeing a lobby. She was seeing a system, a network of interlocking parts, and she was analyzing it with a dispassionate, almost unnerving focus. This quiet observation seemed to infuriate Miller even more than open defiance would have. He saw it as disrespect. "Are you even listening to me?" he snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "Or are you too busy admiring the decor? This is a secure military installation, not a museum. I could have you detained for loitering in a restricted area." He was posturing, of course. Detaining a civilian for a credentialing issue was a mountain of paperwork he had no desire to climb. But the threat was the point. The humiliation was the goal. He wanted to see her flustered, to see a crack in that serene facade. He wanted her to shrink, to apologize, to scurry away as the irrelevant person he had judged her to be. Yet, she offered him nothing. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting his own escalating agitation back at him. It was a profound and powerful form of defense, one for which his training had no counter. He was armed with regulations, with a uniform, with the institutional authority of his post. She was armed with nothing but a deep, unshakable calm that seemed to emanate from her very core. It was a calm that suggested she was not merely waiting for permission to enter. She was observing a flawed system and patiently waiting for it to recognize its own error. The air thickened with unspoken questions. Who was this woman? Why was she so unyielding? And why did her simple, quiet presence feel more authoritative than the sergeant's loud pronouncements? The colonels and majors in line were no longer smirking. They were watching, a flicker of professional curiosity replacing their earlier annoyance. They recognized, even if they couldn't name it, the bearing of someone who was utterly confident in her position, someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Miller, sensing he was losing his audience, made one final, desperate play for dominance. "Last chance, ma'am. Leave the line now, or I will call the military police and have you escorted from the premises." Just as Sergeant Miller uttered the words, escorted from the premises, a strange, almost imperceptible flicker ran through the massive digital display screen hanging over the registration area. For a split second, the crisp, scrolling list of symposium events dissolved into a cascade of green, nonsensical characters before snapping back to normal. Miller didn't notice. He was too focused on the woman in front of him. But Dr. Thorne noticed. Her eyes, which had been fixed on Miller's, darted up to the screen for a fraction of a second, a flicker of intense calculation in their depths. Then it happened again. This time, the flicker was longer, more violent. The lights in the atrium buzzed and dimmed, and a collective groan went through the sophisticated electronic security gates. The biometric scanner in front of Miller blinked from a friendly green to a stark, angry red before going completely dark. His terminal, the source of his power, emitted a sharp, final beep, and the screen went black. A wave of confusion rippled through the line of officers. Then chaos erupted. A base-wide alarm began to blare, a jarring mechanical shriek that echoed off the marble floors. Emergency lights, casting the grand atrium in a hellish red glow, kicked on. Every screen in the vast space went black, replaced by a single, ominous message in stark block letters. Network breach detected. All systems offline. Initiating quarantine protocol. The heavy magnetic locks on the main doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, sealing everyone inside. The symposium, the intellectual heart of the Army, was now a sealed box, completely cut off from the outside world. Panic, a sentiment rarely seen among this cohort of seasoned leaders, began to set in. Officers started shouting, pulling out useless cell phones, their voices a cacophony of urgent, unanswered questions. Security personnel, including a suddenly very pale Sergeant Miller, began rushing about with a frantic energy that betrayed their own confusion. They were following a checklist, but it was a checklist for a fire drill, not for a complete, instantaneous decapitation of their entire digital infrastructure. Amidst the spreading pandemonium, Dr. Eris Thorne became an island of profound and unsettling calm. She hadn't moved an inch. While everyone else was reacting to the crisis, she was observing it, processing it. She set her worn leather satchel on the floor, not with haste, but with the deliberate care of a surgeon laying out her instruments. She knelt down and unclasped it. Inside, there were no personal effects, no wallet, no keys. There was only a single custom-molded foam insert containing a small, strange-looking device that resembled a ruggedized tablet, a thick, coiled cable, and a set of precision screwdrivers. Her movements were a study in efficiency, each action flowing into the next with a practiced rhythm that spoke of thousands of hours of repetition. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated competence. The world could be ending around her, but her hands, steady and sure, were simply performing a task. Sergeant Miller, his face slick with sweat under the red emergency lights, finally noticed her. He saw her kneeling by a wall panel near the dead security gates, one of the small access points for the building's fiber optic network. "Hey, you, civilian," he yelled, his voice cracking with stress. "Get away from there. That's restricted access." He started to move toward her, but was jostled by the crowd of confused officers. Dr. Thorne paid him no mind. She had already selected a specific screwdriver from her kit. With a few deft turns, she had the access panel open, revealing a dense, complex web of blinking lights and multicolored wires. To Miller, it was an incomprehensible mess. To her, it was a language she could read as fluently as any book. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved through the wiring with a surgeon's precision. She wasn't ripping things out. She was gently probing, testing connections, her head tilted as if she were listening to a faint, distant sound that only she could hear. She pulled the thick, coiled cable from her satchel and, with a series of clicks that were shockingly loud in the tense atmosphere, connected her strange tablet directly to a specific port on the server rack. The screen of her device flickered to life, not with a standard operating system, but with lines of raw code that began scrolling at an impossible speed. She wasn't hacking the system. She was performing a diagnostic triage on a dying patient. The act itself was a direct, irrefutable refutation of Miller's earlier insult. He had dismissed her as a history teacher, an irrelevant academic. But here, in the heart of a digital crisis that had paralyzed the Army's top minds, this quiet, unassuming woman was the only person moving with purpose. Her impossible skill was not one of violence or overt power, but of supreme, esoteric knowledge. She was a master of a domain that was invisible to everyone else in the room. Suddenly, the scrolling code on her tablet stopped. A single line blinked in the center of the screen. Her expression didn't change, but there was a new intensity in her eyes. She had found it, the source of the infection, the digital ghost in the machine. With a final, precise series of keystrokes, she executed a command. For a moment, nothing happened. The alarms still blared. The red lights still pulsed. Then, with a loud thunk, a single server rack in the nearby communications closet went dark, physically and immediately disconnected from the network by her command. The effect was instantaneous. The blaring alarm cut off, plunging the atrium into a deafening silence. The red emergency lights switched off, and the normal, white fluorescent lights flickered back on, painfully bright. On the main display screen, the ominous warning message vanished, replaced by a simple system reboot prompt. The heavy magnetic locks on the doors disengaged with a loud, echoing click. The quarantine was broken. The crisis was over. And in the center of it all, kneeling on the floor, was Dr. Eris Thorne, calmly disconnecting her equipment as if she had just finished a routine diagnostic. Every single person in the room, colonels, majors, security guards, and a dumbstruck Sergeant Miller, was staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound disbelief. The arrogance had shattered. The assumptions had evaporated. All that remained was the undeniable evidence of a miracle, performed by the one person they had all so thoroughly and completely underestimated. Into the stunned, cathedral-like silence of the atrium strode a figure of immense authority. General Marcus Madsen was a man carved from granite and institutional memory, a four-star general who had commanded troops on 3 continents and whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by his reputation for having zero tolerance for foolishness. His arrival was not announced, but the crowd of officers parted before him like the Red Sea, their shock momentarily replaced by the ingrained deference to his rank. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. The communications blackout during a symposium on future warfare was not just an inconvenience. It was a catastrophic failure, a personal embarrassment. His cold, blue eyes swept the scene, taking in the rebooting screens, the relieved but confused faces of his officers, and the pale, terrified visage of Sergeant Miller. Then his eyes landed on the woman kneeling on the floor, calmly packing her specialized tools back into their foam casing. Madsen's gaze narrowed. He was a man who understood the nuances of professional behavior. He didn't see a civilian who had tampered with government property. He saw a level of calm, a precision of movement, and a focus under pressure that he had only ever witnessed in the most elite echelons of the special operations community. He ignored the sputtering Sergeant Miller, who was trying to stammer out an explanation, and walked directly to Dr. Thorne. He stopped a few feet away, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply observed. He looked at the open wall panel, at the specific port she had accessed, at the now-dark server rack in the closet. His eyes, trained by decades of strategic analysis, saw a pattern. He saw a choice. She hadn't engaged in a brute force counterhack. She hadn't tried to fight the entire infection. She had performed a surgical strike. She had identified the single, compromised entry point, a newly installed, foreign-made climate control sensor, he would later learn, and had severed it from the network's central nervous system with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. It was a technique of elegant, devastating simplicity. "The Jericho Cascade," General Madsen murmured, the words barely audible, spoken more to himself than to anyone else. It was a semi-mythical cyber warfare maneuver, a theoretical strategy for isolating a network breach by sacrificing a single, targeted segment to save the whole, named for the biblical walls that fell with one targeted blow. It was elegant, efficient, and brutally effective. It was also a maneuver so complex and requiring such a deep understanding of network architecture that most experts believed it was impossible to execute in a real-world crisis. He looked down at the woman, who had now risen to her feet and was looking at him with the same placid, neutral expression she had worn all morning. "What is your name?" the general asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "Thorne," she replied, her voice steady and clear. Dr. Eris Thorne, a flash of recognition, of dawning comprehension, lit General Madsen's eyes. It wasn't a memory of a face, but of a name he had seen on the most highly classified documents of his career, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the deepest chambers of the Pentagon, a name that was a legend in a world that officially did not exist. He turned to his aide, a young, sharp-as-a-tack captain who was hovering nearby. "Captain," Madsen commanded, his voice now ringing with an urgent, new authority. "Give me Dr. Thorne's file, not the visitor's log. I want a real one. Clearance level, Oracle." The captain's eyes widened in disbelief. Clearance level Oracle was not just top secret. It was a designation so restricted that most senior officers believed it was a myth, a boogeyman used to scare junior intelligence analysts. It was reserved for the handful of individuals who were considered foundational pillars of national security, the architects and guardians of the nation's most critical systems. To even speak the name of the clearance level in an open room was a breach of protocol. But the general's tone made it clear this was not a request. The captain, fumbling for a moment, pulled out a military-grade, offline secure tablet, one of the few devices that had remained operational during the blackout. His fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard, his own high-level clearances granting him access to the outer layers of the system. He had to enter 3 separate, cascading password sequences and a biometric thumbprint scan before the system even acknowledged his request. A loading bar appeared on the screen, crawling across with agonizing slowness as the tablet's processor worked to decrypt the requested file. The entire atrium remained silent, every officer watching this silent, digital drama unfold. Sergeant Miller stood frozen, a cold dread seeping into his bones as the reality of his monumental error began to dawn on him. Finally, the file opened. The captain's face went white. He held the tablet out to General Madsen, his hand trembling slightly. General Madsen took the tablet and began to read. He didn't read it to himself. He read it aloud, his voice echoing in the silent hall, each word landing like a hammer blow. Name, Dr. Eris Thorne. Title, Lead Architect, Project Aegis. Madsen paused, looking up at the assembled officers. For those of you who don't know, Project Aegis is the very cyber defense network that protects our entire global command and control infrastructure. She didn't just work on it. She designed it. From the first line of code, he looked back at the tablet. Lead designer, GhostNet Protocol. The secure communications system used by all Tier 1 special operations units. The one that has never, not once, been compromised. He swiped the screen. Authored National Security Directive 7, the foundational doctrine on asymmetrical cyber warfare. The very doctrine this symposium is supposed to be studying. He paused again, his eyes finding Sergeant Miller's. The doctrine that states, in its opening paragraph, that human assumptions are the most vulnerable point in any security system. The general's voice grew quieter, filled with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. Recipient of the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Twice. The only civilian to ever receive the award more than once. Mission classifications. Redacted. 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 Call sign. He looked directly at Dr. Thorne. Call sign. Oracle. The name hung in the air, a revelation of staggering proportions. The Oracle, the legendary, almost mythical figure who the intelligence community spoke of as the ultimate guardian of the nation's digital soul. They had imagined a shadowy figure in a secret bunker somewhere, not this quiet woman in a gray pantsuit. General Madsen lowered the tablet. He stood up to his full, imposing height, straightened the tunic of his dress uniform, and faced Dr. Thorne. Then, in an act that sent a shock wave through the room, the 4-star general, commander of the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, brought his hand up in a slow, perfect ceremonial salute. Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice thick with respect. Mom, it is an honor to have you at my post. For a second, there was only the sight of the saluting general and the still, quiet woman. Then, the full-bird colonel who had been in line behind her, his face a mask of dawning horror and respect, snapped to attention and saluted. Then a major next to him. Then another and another. In a cascading wave, every single uniformed officer in the atrium, from the highest-ranking colonels to the youngest lieutenants, turned to face Dr. Thorne and rendered a sharp, unified salute. It was a silent, thunderous apology, a profound offering of respect to the quiet professional they had all misjudged. And at the front of it all stood Sergeant Miller, forgotten and alone, as the world he thought he understood was completely and irrevocably rearranged around him. The story of what happened to the Sherman Theater entrance did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the secure networks and whispered conversations of Fort Leavenworth with the speed of a digital contagion, becoming an instant legend. By lunchtime, every officer attending the symposium knew the name Dr. Eris Thorne, and they knew the call sign Oracle. The tale was recounted in the officers' club, in the hallways between lectures, and in the barracks that night. It was a story with all the elements of a modern military myth, a humble hero, an arrogant gatekeeper, a moment of crisis, and a stunning vindication. The details grew with each telling. The simple gray pantsuit became the unassuming camouflage of a master. The worn leather satchel became the toolkit of a digital demigod. The single, targeted command she executed became the Oracle's blade, a strike of pure genius that had saved the entire symposium from catastrophic failure. The most immediate and tangible ripple effect was the creation of a new, unofficial piece of Army lexicon. The phrase, "Don't be a Miller," became a common refrain among the younger officers and NCOs, a shorthand warning against the dangers of arrogance, of judging by appearances, and of confusing procedural authority with genuine wisdom. To be a Miller was to be the person who couldn't see the four-star general hiding inside the private, the person who would deny a key to the kingdom because the locksmith didn't look the part. It was a harsh but effective lesson, born from one sergeant's very public humiliation. For the Signal Corps technicians who maintained the base's networks, the event was a quasi-religious experience. The server rack that Dr. Thorne had physically disconnected was treated as a sacred artifact. They didn't bring it back online. Instead, they replaced it, and the old, dark rack was left in its place. A junior specialist, on his own initiative, used a label maker to create a small, simple plaque which he stuck to the server's casing. It read, "The Oracle's light. Silence is not absence. Assumption is not intelligence." 1017 Zulu. It was a monument to the moment when their invisible digital world had been saved by a quiet, visible master. The antagonist of the story, Sergeant Miller, was not simply punished. He was transformed. General Madsen, a man who believed in lessons more than punishments, had him reassigned, not to a penal detail, but to the symposium's transcription and archiving team. For the next 3 days, Miller's job was to sit in a small, windowless room and manually review the digital records of every lecture, every presentation. It was there, in the quiet solitude of his new role, that he was forced to confront the true magnitude of his error. He listened to a recording of Dr. Thorne's keynote address, which she delivered that very afternoon. She had walked onto the stage, not to a hero's welcome, but to a silent, profound standing ovation from 450 of the nation's most powerful military leaders. She had simply nodded, waited for them to sit, and then delivered a lecture so brilliant, so dense with groundbreaking strategic insight, that the entire audience was left scribbling notes in a state of rapt awe. She never mentioned the morning's events. She never spoke of her own accomplishments. She simply did her job, and in doing so, demonstrated a level of professionalism that was more humbling to Miller than any direct rebuke could ever have been. One evening, as Miller was archiving the day's files, he saw Dr. Thorne walking down the hallway, accompanied by General Madsen. They were deep in conversation, two professionals of the highest caliber discussing matters of national importance. Miller, caught in the open, had nowhere to hide. He froze, expecting a glare, a dismissal, or worst of all, pity. As she passed, Dr. Thorne's gaze met his for a brief moment. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was simply a calm, neutral acknowledgement. Then, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before continuing her conversation with the general. That simple gesture, that lack of malice, broke something inside Sergeant Miller. It was an act of grace he knew he did not deserve. In that moment, he understood that her silence at the gate had not been an act of defiance against him personally. It had been the product of a discipline so profound that petty insults and personal ego were simply irrelevant data points, to be observed but not processed. He stood a little straighter, and for the first time in his career, he felt the immense, crushing weight of true respect. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that the uniform he wore gave him authority, but it was competence and character alone that earned him the right to wield it. Meanwhile, Dr. Thorne continued her work. She deflected every attempt by the senior officers to praise her. When a young major approached her and gushed, "Ma'am, what you did was incredible," she had simply replied, without looking up from the technical schematic she was reviewing. "The system had a vulnerability. I corrected it. That is the job Her humility was not false modesty. It was a fundamental aspect of her professional ethos. The work was what mattered. The outcome was the only reward. The quiet, steady, and often invisible labor of maintaining the systems that kept everyone safe was its own justification. Her actions had already become a legend, but the legend was of no interest to her. She was already focused on the next problem, the next vulnerability, the next silent battle that no one would ever know she had fought and won. She was the quiet professional, a guardian who sought no glory, only the continued, uninterrupted functioning of the world she had sworn to protect. Her legacy was not in the story they told about her, but in the security and stability that her unseen work provided every single day. A year passed. The National Defense Symposium at Fort Leavenworth was once again in full swing. The theme, unsurprisingly, was resilience in the digital age. Lessons from the Oracle, the incident of the previous year, had been declassified, sanitized, and transformed into a core teaching case study for the entire Department of Defense. At the entrance to the Sherman Theater, the process of checking in was noticeably different. The state-of-the-art security gates were still there, but the human element had been profoundly recalibrated. The security personnel were still sharp, still professional, but their focus had changed. They were quieter, more observant. They were trained to look past the uniform, past the credentials, and to assess the individual. They looked at how people carried themselves, at the focus in their eyes, at the economy of their movements. The new training doctrine for the base's security detail was officially titled the Aegis Protocol, but everyone on the ground called it the Oracle Protocol. It was a living legacy, a direct institutional change born from one woman's quiet competence. A new sergeant stood where Miller had stood a year before, briefing his team of young soldiers. He was sharp, professional, and his voice was calm and measured. "Listen up," he said. His team gathered around him. "Your job today is not to be a wall. It is to be a filter." A year ago, on this very spot, a sergeant saw a piece of plastic and a plain suit, and he failed to see the person who built the very ground we're standing on. He heard silence and assumed weakness. He saw a lack of credentials in his system and assumed a lack of importance in the world. That was a catastrophic failure of imagination. He pointed toward the entrance. Everyone who walks through that door is a data set. Look for anomalies. But remember the primary lesson of the Oracle Protocol. The most significant signature a person can have is the absence of a signature. The most capable people in the world are often the most quiet. They don't need to broadcast their importance because their importance is self-evident in their work. Your job is to learn how to see them. This was Dr. Thorne's true, lasting impact. It wasn't the single crisis she had averted, but the cultural shift she had inspired. Her actions had forced an institution built on hierarchy and visible markers of rank to confront the reality that true worth is often invisible, and that the greatest threats are not loud invasions but quiet, insidious assumptions. The story had become a powerful piece of institutional folklore, a modern parable told to new recruits at intelligence schools and to young lieutenants at officer basic courses. It served as a constant reminder that competence is the only currency that truly matters, and that respect must be earned through action, not demanded by rank. The final keynote speaker of this year's symposium was General Madsen. He stood at the podium, looking out at the new generation of military leaders. His speech was not about new weapons systems or geopolitical strategy. It was about the character of the professional. "We spend billions on technology," he began, his voice resonating with authority. "We build firewalls, both digital and physical. But we learned last year, right here in this room, that the greatest vulnerability is never in our systems. It is in our assumptions. We learned that a single individual, armed with quiet competence and a profound lack of ego, is a more powerful strategic asset than an entire carrier group." He spoke of a legacy that is not written in headlines or carved onto monuments. He spoke of the silent professionals, the architects, the analysts, the maintainers, the guardians like Dr. Thorne, whose names are largely unknown, but whose work forms the bedrock of national security. He described a legacy written not in books of history, but in lines of secure code that protect a nation's secrets. A legacy measured not in medals pinned to a uniform, but in the countless crises that were averted, the silent disasters that never happened because someone, somewhere, was quietly and competently doing their job. A legacy carried not by the loud voices of self-promotion, but by the steady, focused work of those who seek no credit. True strength, he concluded, his gaze sweeping across the auditorium, does not need to announce itself. True competence does not need a boast, and true respect is not something you can demand with your rank. It is a debt that is paid, in silence and in full, to demonstrated excellence. Your challenge, as leaders, is to build an army that can recognize that excellence, no matter what form it takes. Your duty is to see the quiet professional, to listen to the silent expert, and to never, ever mistake a lack of volume for a lack of value. His words hung in the air. A new doctrine for a new era. A final, powerful testament to the woman who had come to teach them about cyber warfare and had ended up teaching them about the very soul of their profession. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.